All right, welcome everyone to Friday of this Provo conference. Thank you for being here this morning. I look forward to talking with a lot of you later today and throughout the conference. For those that don't know me, I'm Megan Booth. I'm the Vice President of Utah APA, and I'm a principal at Salt Lake City. I'm happy to introduce our keynote today, who is Shane Phillips, and he's going to be joined on the stage by Steve Waldrop. And I think that it's going to be a great keynote. I'll just go ahead and give a brief introduction. Shane Phillips is the Housing Initiative Project Manager at UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. He's a housing researcher, writer, and consultant. He manages the Randall Lewis Housing Initiative at UCLA. He asked that I not read his bio, so I'll stop there and let him introduce himself. So welcome to the stage. Everyone give him a round of applause.
It is really hard to listen to people introduce you for too long. It gets increasingly uncomfortable, so I appreciate a brief introduction. Well, morning everyone. I feel like everyone's trying to be as far away from me as possible. I know I'm from California, but we're not all that bad. Yeah, I'll give a little bit of background about myself. So just to start things off here. Hello, my name is Shane Phillips. I grew up in Washington State. I moved a lot between suburbs around Puget Sound, as far north as Bellingham, which is right up on the border with Canada, as far south as Bellevue, which is right around Seattle, for those familiar with that part of the country. I've got a pretty unusual background. I dropped out of high school, worked as a cable installer at Comcast, package loader and sorter at UPS. I returned to school, got a degree in biochemistry, for some reason. I worked as a tuberculosis researcher for several years at the University of Washington and took the MCAT, was actually applying for medical schools, but at a certain point realized that what I was really passionate about, or what I had become passionate about, was not medicine, but was urban planning. So I went back to school, and 15 years later, here I am before you with a pretty wide-ranging knowledge of housing and land use and a very vague memory of some impressive sounding phrases like gel electrophoresis, transposon vectors, homologous recombination. I could not tell you what those mean, but I do remember those words. I've been at UCLA now for a little over 5 years now, and in my role there, I manage the housing research and policy analysis at the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies with a collection of staff and faculty and students and other collaborators from other schools and the private sector and the public sector. And we study a whole bunch of things, everything from the effects of different policies on housing production, on cost and affordability, on housing stability and displacement, segregation, access to opportunity, access to credit, you name it. I am very much a researcher at heart, and I am entirely capable of spending a half a day just absorbed by a big data set of building permits or of parcels or of census microdata. I sadly have less time for that these days, but what I am really passionate about is sharing the knowledge that's generated at schools like UCLA with people like yourselves and offering policy ideas and communication tools and whatever else I can really to come up with, to help you turn that knowledge into better outcomes, into healthier, happier, more productive people with more comfortable and more fulfilling lives. So on that note, before we dig in here, I do want to put on your radar an educational resource that we've been producing at the Lewis Center for 3.5 years now. It's called the UCLA Housing Voice Podcast. And in it, every 2 weeks, we publish an interview with a housing researcher about some work that they've recently published. Housing scholars are constantly creating new knowledge every single day, but it is usually produced with other academic researchers in mind and not really for the general public. And honestly, not even policymakers and advocates and folks like you who work in this space. It is just not really targeted at you, unfortunately. So we're doing our small part to try and bridge that gap. Our goal has been for these 3 years to sift through all of this emerging knowledge, the hundreds and hundreds of papers that come out every year, and bring a few of them to a wider audience, talking with the researchers who actually did the work to understand what they found and most importantly, what we should make of it. We've now published nearly 80 episodes, each about an hour long, and we've covered just about every topic you can imagine. You can actually also get AICP credit for listening, for anyone interested. A friend actually just told me yesterday in an event that he met his entire year's credit requirements just by listening to the podcast. So that's always an option for you if you don't hear enough of my voice here. A lot of the topics I'll be sharing here today are explored in much greater detail in one or more episodes of UCLA Housing Voice, so check that out if it's of interest. It's something we invest a lot of time in, and it's genuinely my favorite part of my job, and if housing is your thing, I think you'll appreciate it. All right, on to the book. So I also wrote a book 4 years ago called The Affordable City. I guess we'll go back. There we go. You're going to know why you should not be like Los Angeles if it's not already clear. So the Affordable City is, I'll just go back to this slide, is a sort of handbook of policies that can help cities stay affordable, become more affordable, and it's targeted at a pretty wide audience. It has nearly 6 policies, and while researching and writing this book, I started thinking about what connected all of these policies, because I didn't just want it to be this endless list of things you could do. The themes that I came up with were supply, stability, and subsidy. And the book is as much an argument for why cities and states should pursue those 3 goals as it is a guide for how to do so. Those 3 S's are going to be the focus of my talk today. I focus on them in part because I think they keep us honest, making sure we don't lose sight of different needs and populations, and also because I believe that a holistic approach is how you show different people and different groups that you see them and build credibility, and it's a basis for the collaboration and coalition building that we need to turn these policies into reality. So as I said, we're going to get to California. I think it's important to explain myself. I am sure that some of you are wondering why you have someone from California here talking to you about how to make housing affordable. And not even just California, but Los Angeles, of all places. I would also love to offer you some sage advice on low taxes and low traffic congestion if you're interested. But honestly, it is very fair to be skeptical. Like, what could you have to learn about housing affordability from someone who lives in, by many measures, the least affordable metro area in the entire country? My short answer is that there is actually a lot to learn from LA, but it's mostly as a cautionary tale. I am here to tell you not to be like Los Angeles. Learn from the mistakes that we have made and do everything you can not to repeat them. I have a longer, more substantive answer as well, and it's that although LA's problems can seem very distant, they are much closer than you think. On the one hand, yes, housing in LA is far more expensive. The median home costs nearly $1 million. At current interest rates, you need to earn more than $200,000 a year to afford the median home for it to be considered affordable. Not only would that require a $7,000 a month mortgage, you would also need to somehow come up with a $200,000 down payment for the privilege of taking out that $800,000 loan. Home prices have gone up a lot in Utah over the past few years, as they have throughout the country. But prices in LA are still almost double those in most of Utah's markets, or more than double. So in that sense, and in many other ways as well, we are very different places. But on the other hand, when I study communities across the country, when I visit them, I see almost everyone doing exactly the same things that got Los Angeles where it is today, and all of California where it is today. I see plans and zoning codes that were written in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and have barely been updated in the ensuing 50 or 60 years, or to adapt to the ways that society and technology has progressed. I see communities betting their future and the future of their children on the hope that if they don't plan for more residents, then more residents won't come. I see the same indecision and delay and inaction with precious few exceptions, and I see the fruits of a growing economy being captured by our homes rather than by ourselves and by our neighbors. I'm sure this sounds very familiar to many of you in this room. Los Angeles is certainly reaping what it sowed for these many years of inaction. Homes that cost more than double what the typical middle-class family can afford, more overcrowded households than anywhere in the nation, and among the longest and most unpredictable and unpleasant commutes. We struggle to hold on to businesses that don't have their customer base in Los Angeles, and a huge share of our budget goes towards solving housing and homelessness problems that we largely created for ourselves. Upward of $1 billion of our $13 billion budget in the city goes toward essentially homelessness services and response. Worst, we have utterly failed the 50,000 people who have no home to sleep in on any given night in the city, about 1 in every 80 residents. 4 of whom die on our streets every day on average. This failure also affects the quality of life for our city's other 3.95 million residents, with everything from parks to transit to healthcare facilities disproportionately strained by an unhoused population and public spaces of all kinds serving as a housing of last resort. This was all done in the name of protecting our unique neighborhood character, the things that made Los Angeles special and that residents most loved and appreciated about living there. The ironic and very sad truth is that we could not have destroyed those things more effectively if we had tried. Have you ever seen a toddler hug a cat or a dog? The pure, innocent love being expressed by the child and the look of desperate fear on the animal's face? Loving something does not mean holding it so tightly that it can't breathe. We have to allow the things we love to exist separately from us. Most of us learn that when it comes to people, eventually. Most of us learn that when it comes to pets. But it's a lesson that many of us still have not learned when it comes to cities and neighborhoods. In LA, as in many places, we made the mistake of believing we could build a great place and then freeze it in time, and that no one else would ever want to be a part of that wonderful place that we had built. We believed, as many people still seem to, that the built environment was more essential to the character of our neighborhoods than the neighbors themselves. I love where I live, but I am very mad at the people who made these decisions and, in many cases, keep making them. What I want to emphasize is that from a housing policy perspective, from a land use perspective, California is not so different from Provo or Salt Lake City or West Jordan or St. George or your neighbors in Colorado or Wyoming or the rest of the United States. What really distinguishes where I live from where you live, again, just on housing, I understand how you might feel being compared to LA too much. What really distinguishes you from us is that demand for housing hit LA earlier and it hit harder. But we are on very similar trajectories, just at different points along that trend line. So that is the bad news, but in some ways it's also the good news. It means you can change course before you end up with LA-sized problems. The reality is that the longer you wait, the worse things will get, and actually the harder it becomes to solve the problems that crop up. But the sooner you act, the more options you will have. Events like this conference are obviously one part of that process. So my book, The Affordable City, includes over 50 policy recommendations, but my focus in presentations like this is not really on policy. It's more on big picture priorities. I do this because, frankly, policies are pretty easy to come by, and in scholarly and professional circles like your own, there's fairly broad agreement about the kinds of policies that can improve housing affordability. Not unanimity, but quite a bit of agreement. The challenge to me, is not coming up with a list of effective policies. It is implementing them in a world where every change comes with trade-offs, with winners and losers, with unintended consequences to accompany the intended ones, and where changing course is always harder than maintaining the status quo, even when we know that the status quo is taking us down the wrong track. The challenge is convincing people that they will be better off in some alternate future where we've chosen a different path. My framework for thinking about balancing these trade-offs and for meeting these wide ranges of needs is what I call the 3 S's: supply, stability, and subsidy. And so first I'm going to talk about supply here. Supply is really about making sure we have enough housing to meet current and future needs, not just to accommodate population growth, but also to improve the housing stock, to respond to demographic shifts like an aging population and shrinking household sizes. It's about managing long-term economic shifts and technological shifts that lead to rising incomes, increasing remote and hybrid work. It's about meeting other goals like preserving open space and agricultural land, increasing access to opportunity, attracting and retaining jobs and businesses. The future is going to look different from the past, as it always has, and supply is ultimately a big part of how you deliver on that transition. It is not a coincidence that supply is the first of the 3 S's in my book. I start here because the mismatch between housing supply and housing demand is the root cause of high and rising prices in most US cities, and most cities, period. There is no place in America where housing is both scarce and affordable. The two things cannot coexist. Housing abundance is not always sufficient for housing affordability, but it is a necessary ingredient, and too many cities lack it. Fundamentally, prioritizing housing supply is about acknowledging that we live in a world of physical and economic constraints. There's the physical constraint that a growing, aging, and increasingly wealthy population requires a growing and improving stock of homes. We just need the space. The United States does have a serious inequality problem compared to many other developed countries, and that inequality extends to housing, but you cannot redistribute your way out of a shortage. If you want to reduce scarcity, you have to actually build things. There's also the economic reality that when housing is scarce, homeowners and landlords gain market power, and while that is certainly nice for them, that power comes at the expense of home buyers and renters, and ultimately out of the pockets of future generations. We have decades of evidence showing that when cities build more housing, they are better able to keep rents and prices in check. And that's true whether the homes are market rate or subsidized. They'll both help, and both have both benefits and shortcomings. And it's also true for neighborhoods as it is for cities and metro areas. The immediate goal of supply policies is housing abundance, as I said, and abundance is not just about the number of homes, but how suitable they are to a community's various and changing needs, from single adults to large families, and from birth to early career to retirement. I doubt it's necessary for me to say this, but just so there's no mystery what I mean by supply policies, this is things like zoning and building codes, review and approval processes, development standards like parking and setbacks. All of these determine what can be built, how costly and risky it is to build, and thus who can afford it and who can't. These are all subjects that I think most of the people in this room deal with on a daily basis, so nothing new here. I do want to be clear, though, that supply policies can also be focused on helping restore or preserve the housing that we already have. Things like protecting against an oversaturation of short-term rentals, for example. The market plays an important, critical role in delivering on supply, but every market lives or dies by the quality of its regulation. So next up is stability. Stability is largely about making sure as much as possible that when change comes to a community, it doesn't come at the expense of those with the least to lose. A rising tide does not, in fact, always lift all boats. Evidence for that can be found in the fact that the highest rates of homelessness are consistently found in our nation's wealthiest cities, not its poorest. Stability is not about freezing our cities in amber, or our neighborhoods in amber, or absolving people of personal responsibility. It is about providing some measure of security and predictability for everyone who does their part and follows the rules. But to put this more philosophically, if supply is about acknowledging physical and economic constraints, then stability for me is about acknowledging the moral obligations that we have to our fellow citizens and neighbors. Stabilizing policies can include things like eviction protections, rent stabilization, non-discrimination rules. Skeptics are quick to point out, always, that these policies have hidden costs, sometimes not so hidden, and they are right. I could point to plenty of cities that have implemented rent control policies to disastrous effect, for example. But I could just as easily point to cities that have misused supply and subsidy policies, so really the details always matter. But I think if we envision our future in Utah or anywhere else, I think that most of us can agree it should be one where people can't have their rent hiked 20 or 30% in a single year, where they're not evicted without cause and with very little warning, even in winter, and where they're not treated as second-class citizens for renting and not owning a home, or for living in multifamily housing rather than single family. In the past, I think the attitude toward housing stability was that if you wanted security and predictability, buy a home. That has always been a very flawed idea. For one thing, access to home ownership has never been equal in America, and we are still living in the world shaped by policies like urban renewal and redlining. But as far as arguments go, just buy a home was at least a lot more defensible 30 or 50 years ago, when homes cost 1 or 2 times the typical salary of a single breadwinner than now. Now there are very few places in the country where you can buy a home for less than 4 or 5 times the median income for a 2-earner household, and in many cases the ratio is 6, 7, 8 to 1 or more. In Salt Lake City, it was 7.5 to 1 in 2022, and here in Provo it's a little over 8. In LA, which is I think the highest place in the country, it's 12 to 1, $80,000 median income, $1 million median home value. As many examples as there are of destructive and counterproductive stabilizing policies, there are many more examples of them working just fine. They don't need to be so strong and punitive that landlords lose all rights and privileges in favor of tenants, or so thoroughly erode the profitability, or frankly erode profitability at all, of building and operating housing so that supply dries up. All we need, and what we really lack in most of the country, is a better balance. And the right balance will be different in California than in Utah, and it will be different in different jurisdictions in Utah from one another. The final S, subsidies. In many parts of the economy, well-designed markets can serve most people more efficiently and effectively than government. And I believe very strongly that applies to housing as well. Markets have incredible power. Most of our homes were not subsidized. They were built by a developer who profited, and we are perfectly happy with the homes we're living in. But no matter how well designed the market, no matter how much housing it produces, some people will still be unable to afford housing at some point in their lives, whether that's for a few days or for many years. And when all their other options have failed them, they will become homeless. By the same token, even though stability policies are important and valuable, they're really about protecting people from worsening circumstances, like rising rents or eviction. They do not have much power to proactively improve people's lives. Supply and stability policies leave gaps, and subsidies are one important tool for filling them. Whether it's supporting construction of housing affordable to middle and lower income families, funding long-term rent assistance programs like housing vouchers, providing shorter-term assistance like transitional housing, or operating homelessness shelters, just for some examples. The reality is that as a nation, we already spend a boatload on housing subsidies. That's a technical word for you folks. You're right next to a big lake. I assume you know how much a boatload is. The problem is that almost all that money just goes to homeowners, and actually, so maybe 80% or so of the subsidies we give out, and most of that 80% goes to the wealthiest homeowners, the ones with incomes over $150,000 to $200,000 a year or so, in the form of tax exemptions on mortgage interest, on property tax, on capital gains, on imputed rent, all of these things limited to homeowners alone. I'm not going to get further into the weeds on that in this presentation, but I do just want to make that point. If you're skeptical of subsidies, then I hope that skepticism will at least apply to the subsidies going to upper income people and homeowners as well. Without spending some level of public resources on housing, and specifically housing assistance to people who don't make $200,000 per year and don't already own their homes, many people are going to be left behind as our economies and communities change, as we've already seen. Without subsidies, people who could have quickly gotten back on their feet with a little support end up falling into much worse circumstances, ultimately requiring much more intensive, long-term, and costly assistance down the road. We've seen this with homelessness, for sure, that we can reduce long-term costs to the public by providing assistance early, and it is often more costly to leave a person living on the street, using emergency health services, interacting more often with law enforcement, than to simply provide them a relatively small amount of financial assistance to help them get back into a home. To take a step back here, there is a very simple message underlying the 3 S's, and it's that different people in different communities have different needs, and the same person or community, their needs change over time as well. That being the case, it is impossible to meet all of these various needs with just one tool, or just by prioritizing supply or stability or subsidy. A new market rate apartment building will help rents from rising as quickly across the housing market, and I will talk about that later, but it doesn't do anything for someone who is facing an imminent eviction, for example. Supportive housing is a critical part of the solution to homelessness, but it doesn't do anything to keep homeownership within reach of a middle-class family. And that's perfectly okay. That's not the purpose of these types of efforts and policies. No policy can do it all, and we shouldn't expect it to, but each of the 3 S's has the power to shore up the weaknesses and cover the blind spots of the others. To me, the changes in the housing market that we saw following the outbreak of COVID-19 are the best possible example of why supply is not a complete substitute for stability or subsidy. It showed us how fast demand for housing can rise or can shift from one place to another or from one housing typology to another. Many people were suddenly able to work from home, and demand for suburban locations and more spacious homes went through the roof, at least for a time. Rents in many places went up 20 or 30% in 1 year. Supply helps moderate rent and price growth, but it takes years to plan and build housing, even in the best circumstances, and people often cannot wait that long for help to arrive. Without policies like rent stabilization or a healthy amount of subsidies, or both, or those, or other things in their place, we can't really offer a credible response to the family whose rent increased from $1,500 to $2,000 in a single year, and who can't move elsewhere without losing access to gainful employment and a family network that saves them thousands of dollars each year on childcare, and can't buy a home anytime soon because the median home costs 7 times their income. A few months ago, I was in Hendersonville, North Carolina, and a council member there told a group of us about a woman he knew, a 78-year-old widow who was being evicted. The building owner was getting older himself, and his son took over the management of the property, not an uncommon story, and he wanted to renovate it, and he told the old lady she needed to leave. She lives on something like $2,000 a month and had nowhere else to go, but the son just wouldn't budge. This woman is lucky to have a council member and other neighbors looking for solutions, but not everyone is so fortunate, and we shouldn't leave people to their fate in that way. And even with that support, in this case, at the time I was there, their best solution was a waiting list that was 6 months long when she was facing eviction in a month or 2. I think we should ask ourselves what kinds of policies we would support if it meant preventing our own grandmother from becoming homeless. If there's a big gap between that, what we actually support right now, and that, as I think there is for many of us, as there has been for me at different times, there probably still is in some ways, we should ask why we can't extend that same empathy and accommodation to other people. But for all that stabilizing policies can give people breathing room and help them navigate crises, they mostly do not address the underlying causes of housing unaffordability and instability. Cities like San Francisco and New York are poster children for what happens when you try to use subsidy and stability policies as a substitute for an adequate supply of housing rather than as a complement to it. Beyond the effects of these different policy priorities, this all matters from a coalition building perspective as well. Every community is going to have a wide array of groups and interests, and none of us is going to get anything done without making common cause with others, which starts with understanding other people's needs and values. Evaluating our future plans through the lenses of supply, stability, and subsidy, or something like it, is one way of making sure that we are at least considering those different perspectives and pushes us to identify solutions that take them into account so we can all go forward together. Since writing The Affordable City, I've learned that when people read or hear about the 3 S's, they can be tempted to engage in what we might call selective listening. They will like a point or two in favor of supply policies like upzoning or minimum lot size reform, but not stabilizing policies like rent stabilization or eviction protections or vice versa. Or they'll like the idea of more subsidies for affordable housing development, sure, but not reforms to strengthen production of market rate for-profit housing, or again, vice versa. So they'll pick 1 or 2 priorities and they'll just throw away the rest. I can't stop you, you're free to do that, but I would prefer that you think about that supply, stability, and subsidy as more of a 3-legged stool for affordable communities, something that is sturdy and resilient when all the legs are in place, but when you remove any one of them, the whole thing topples right over. Supply without stability can create unnecessary harm. It adds housing, which is important, but it can do so without any regard for the locations or kinds of development that will do the most good, or that are most likely to have negative consequences, like displacement of existing residents. Supply without any accompanying subsidies leaves many struggling households still too poor to afford even the lowest quality housing on the market, at least for some amount of time, and they are left behind, sometimes to live on our streets. Stability without supply, or without subsidy, it doesn't really improve conditions, it just manages decline. Stability policies can delay, treat, mitigate the symptoms of a dysfunctional housing market, and that is important and necessary work, but these kinds of policies rarely address the underlying causes. Subsidy without stability can result in many people needing assistance who might not have needed it otherwise, and when people lack housing security, they're much more likely to rely on public assistance. And finally, subsidy without supply is a recipe for endlessly increasing costs. This is in some ways the story of Los Angeles, and it's why 6 years after spending a few $billions on housing services and construction of new affordable homes for homeless residents, we now have even more homelessness than we started with. Meanwhile, the cost of building a 400 square foot supportive housing unit in an apartment building has increased from an already high $350,000 to $600,000 per unit. Those two facts are not unrelated, by the way. To be clear, I have no doubt that we would have been worse off if we had not spent that money. The homelessness problem would be much worse. But we failed to address the underlying problem of rising rents across the whole market. And now, although we are helping more people out of homelessness each year than we ever have, the number becoming homeless every year is growing at an even faster rate. Supply, stability, and subsidy just work much better together than apart. Supply is really the thing that you have the most control over locally, and I imagine a lot of people here work locally. It's also, frankly, the area you're most likely to get the bipartisan support at the state or federal level, so I'm going to dig into this one a bit further. First, I just want to get us on the same page about the supply picture, how it's looked in the US over the last half century or so. This first chart shows per capita housing production since about 1960. Even with regular ups and downs that always follow the economic cycle, you can see a very clear downward trend decade after decade. Housing is growing scarcer, and the predictable result is that it's also growing less affordable. This image shows per capita housing production in major metro areas across the country for 2 time periods, 1990 to 2007 in orange, and then 2008 to 2018 in green. What it shows is really striking to me. Every one of the metro areas built less housing in the decade following the global financial crisis than in the 18 years that preceded it, per year and per capita. Cities with some of the highest demand, like LA and New York City, built barely any housing during either period, which is why so many Californians are moving to Nevada and Texas and Montana and Arizona and North Carolina, and I would bet quite a few are coming here too. And I apologize. As a researcher, I really do try to do my best, genuinely try to do my best to accommodate different interpretations of research. It is complicated, and how you structure a study, how you write about it can skew things. But within the world of housing research, there is almost nothing I can say with more confidence than that if you have 2 cities with similar demand, and the one that builds more will end up more affordable over the medium and long term. There is a very common belief that building homes attracts rich people, and that those rich people moving in is what drives up the price of nearby housing. I hear that very often, I'm sure you do as well, and I absolutely understand why people jump to that conclusion. But the fact that it is understandable does not mean it's right, and there is a lot of evidence that it's not. The reality is, all over the country, that most of the people who move into new housing are from the same metro area where that housing was built. I grew up in Washington State, as I said, and if you've moved from one part of the country to another, you may understand this a little more intuitively. If you go to a website like Zillow or apartments.com, you can look for homes in specific cities or counties, and you can filter your search by all kinds of housing characteristics, single family, multifamily, square footage, bedrooms, year the building was built, etc. Now, there are 340 million people in this country. That makes for a whole lot of diversity, a whole wide world of preferences from boring to bizarre. But if there is one person among these 340 million people who has gone on one of these sites searching only for new multifamily housing without any geographic preference, I would be shocked if that were true. Like, I don't care whether it's in St. Louis or Provo or Buffalo or Portland, and if it's Portland, I don't care if it's Portland, Oregon, or Portland, Maine, or Portland, Tennessee. There's like 30 Portlands. Just as long as it's got at least 10 units and was built in the last 3 years. That's what I'm looking for. For fun, I could see someone doing that. As a serious approach to deciding where to live, that would be insane. It would be insane. No one does that. No one would ever do that. But in a very real way, that is essentially what we're saying when we say that building new housing attracts rich people. What most of us do, actually, and what I think all of us should be free to do, is we get a job or a college acceptance offer, or our family grows or shrinks, or it wants to be closer together, or it wants to be much further apart, or we just decide we want to live in a specific city that is somewhere different, and then we look for housing in that place. Most of us do not limit our search to newly built housing. Many of us don't even prefer it. And even those who do will usually settle for older housing if new homes are not available. The thing about new housing is that it's usually pretty expensive. So if none of it's available for these rich people to move into, they can always just find something older. That's why refusing to build new homes just exacerbates this problem. It does not change the fact that people want to live in your city. The demand is there. What it does, instead, is force those people to compete for the older homes when they arrive, driving up its price and squeezing out the lower and middle income households who really depend on that housing. When we build housing, it has the effect of pulling people out of older, more affordable units into newer and better stock. I think I'm off by a slide here, I apologize. It creates vacancies in those older units that create slack in the market and help stabilize rents and prices. When we don't build, that upward pull turns into a downward push. As demand grows in that situation, people with the most resources crowd out those with fewer, pushing them into lower quality housing and neighborhoods. Upper income households end up pushing middle income households into lower income neighborhoods, and the people already in those lower income neighborhoods are pushed into overcrowded conditions or to other cities and towns or out of state or onto the street. And to be clear, this is not just me theorizing here. This is not just a guess or an intuition. We see this empirically in both the US and abroad in something called migration chains or moving chains. This is actually very recent research. As I said, when new buildings open up, data shows that the majority of people moving in come from the same metro area, and that means they're leaving behind a home somewhere nearby. And that home is almost always more affordable than the one that they've just moved into. The same applies to whoever moves into that newly vacated unit. They are usually leaving behind something more affordable too. Most moves throughout people's lives are upward into something bigger or better. To put some illustrative numbers to this, imagine a new market rate apartment building opens up and the units rent for $2,000 a month. That's expensive. I don't know if it's very expensive here or just kind of expensive. It would be very cheap in LA, sadly. But let's say household A recently got a promotion and they can afford it. So they move in and they leave behind an apartment that just didn't really meet their needs anymore, which rents for $1,600 a month. After the landlord touches up the vacated unit, puts it back on the market, household B moves in, maybe at $1,600, maybe at $1,700, and they leave behind a unit that was renting for $1,300 per month. This is the second link in the moving chain. Jump ahead to the fifth move, and research shows that about half of the people moving into the units that have become vacant in that link in the chain are earn below their city's median income, and almost a third have incomes in the bottom fifth, the poorest 20% of households. And that's what this chart on the right shows. Again, this is not theoretical. Researchers tracked addresses of tens of thousands of individual people across dozens of metro areas over multiple years to document this effect. When all is said and done, 100 of these relatively expensive market rate apartment units create vacancies in somewhere around 30 to 50 units of this much lower cost housing, either in the below median or even below 20th percentile. This is housing that is priced at levels you just can't achieve in new buildings without very significant subsidies. This directly benefits the people moving into these more affordable homes, of course, but it also creates slack in the market, giving landlords a little less leeway to increase rents on everyone else, including the much larger group of people who are just staying in place in their rental unit year to year. It ultimately rebalances market power between tenants and landlords, and in a similar way between home buyers and home sellers, and it does all this without using any public funds. None of this is to say that market rate buildings are a substitute for subsidies, either for affordable housing construction or for rent assistance, but what it shows is that the two approaches are complementary, and I really want to emphasize that. Market rate housing and subsidized housing are complementary. Market rate homes stabilize rents and prices and ensure a continuously improving housing stock that we're going to get most of our housing. And by stabilizing prices, they also tend to make subsidies go further, whether you spend a lot on them or just a little. All right, I have so little time, so I'm going to skip. How much should I skip? Let's see. I'll talk about a few things I'm kind of excited about. Well, this is probably a good thing to emphasize. So aside from this all being a thing, supply being something that local governments can actually do in a way that is much harder to do, subsidy and stability at scale, another reason I focus on supply is just to emphasize the fact that building more homes and more diverse types of homes is not just a burden that we have to bear. We focus so much on the burdens that come with growth, and they are real, and they're not always fairly or equally distributed, but it's exactly this growth that gave us all the places and things that we love and treasure today. It's an opportunity to build a better future for ourselves and for others. What I hope all of you can appreciate and help others to appreciate is that When the place you live is in demand, you have options. You can harness that demand and turn it into something positive. Your kids want to stay here when they grow up. Others want to come here and put down roots. People believe in your community and they want to invest their time and their money here, and that means new shops and hospitals and infrastructure, new and better services, new friends, new neighbors, new employees. That is an incredible thing, and it is a blessing to be celebrated and not a curse to lament. There are thousands of cities and towns across America, I have been to some of them, that would give anything to have the problems that come with desirability and the need to grow and evolve. So on that note, I have come to think that cities and towns really just have three possible futures. Over the medium and long term, cities are either shrinking or they are growing in one of two ways. If you're in demand, then growth is ultimately inevitable, but the form it takes depends on how you respond. One possibility is that you channel that demand into a growing housing stock. The other is channeling it into higher housing prices and rents. Demand will always find an outlet. For any amateur economists in the room, this is basically supply elasticity without the curves that no one understands, myself included. But the basic idea is you can build and thereby keep housing abundant and affordable, or you can not build and instead force people into this cruel game of musical chairs, as it's been described, where those with the fewest resources are left with nowhere to sit, and more to the point, nowhere to sleep when the music stops. Down that path lies worsening affordability, deteriorating homes, declining numbers of children and young families, overcrowding, supercommuting, homelessness. Down that path lies Los Angeles. The third option is reserved for places where people don't really want to be or stay. They're places that are stagnating or in decline. I don't think anyone here wants to lower prices by wrecking Utah's economy, and I don't think you want to follow my city down path number two. I think it has to, or path number one, I think it has to be that first option. Here's another way of putting this, and I think I'll close with this, and maybe we can talk about some of the other slides as part of the follow-up. You can have a community that is appealing, affordable, and unchanging, but you can only pick two. If it's appealing and unchanging, it is not going to be affordable. This describes places that draw a lot of people but build very little housing. Places like Los Angeles and New York on the larger end, places like Berkeley and Boulder on the smaller end. If your city or town is unchanging and affordable, that's a pretty sure sign it is lacking in appeal. This is the story of many Rust Belt cities that have deindustrialized. And if it's appealing and affordable, then change is coming. People are coming, whether you plan for them or not, and that is absolutely their right. You can focus on the negatives and let that paralyze and overwhelm you, or you can do the work and turn that to your benefit. So I want to give us time for questions. I will just say, as we close up here, if I can get to my final slide. I hope we can talk about these three slides in particular. I just want to flag those for the next 10 or 15 minutes, but here we go. I just want to reiterate this last point. Our cities and towns are not so fragile that they will be ruined by more people. And you all will play a big role in ensuring that the growth and change that happens leads to communities that we love even more tomorrow than we do today. I know very well, personally, how challenging this work can be day to day in the trenches, but I hope we will not forget that when we succeed, even a little bit, we are able to expand our circles and help our communities share their opportunities and their friendship and their care with as many people as possible, and I think that's something worth looking forward to. So thank you again for this invitation, and I guess we're gonna get some questions.